Welcome. This is the Global Summit House podcast. Catch power interviews and discussions with influential, inspiring, and powerful people. Explore what's possible by tuning into this podcast with our all-new The Writers Project episodes, featuring one of the world's most inspired thinkers and writers. Visit our website at www.globalsummithouse.com.
I am really pleased to meet and interview Mr. Joseph Roccasalvo. You are a fascinating guy with an amazing background that has taken so many different facets of your life and taken them into being a writer. And so I want to welcome you, Joseph. Thank you so much for being here.
Well, thank you for having me.
Joseph, talk a little bit about how you've gotten into being such an amazing writer with so many different stories and different forms, from novels to collections of short stories. How did you get there?
Well, it was a long journey. I think it largely was a matter of recognizing who and what my deeper self was. I was trained as an academic. I was always exposed to storytelling. My mom used to sit by my bedside and create these wonderful fictional narratives before I went to sleep. And she would make them up as she went along. And then later I managed to discover books that she left behind. In fact, she left 29 volumes of memoirs. It was extraordinary. I mean, she kept writing every day of her life. And then I found poetry and short stories and so forth. So there's no question that Mother was an icon of the mind, of the imagination. And she urged me to always think with my full faculties. When I went on to high school and college, it was largely very academic. When I was in high school, I did the classics with the Jesuits. And then when I went on to college, I took a degree program in English literature and philosophy, then theology. And then Harvard decided to grant me a scholarship and join their global studies program, so that I was able, as it were, to travel in my mind to all of these extraordinary places, to be dealing with people east and west. My mind was always roving. But I have to say that most of my mentors, both the Jesuits and certainly my profs at Harvard, seemed to appeal mostly to my intellectual ability, which they said was considerable. But I just took their word for it and decided to give them back what they wanted. However, I always felt something was missing. I always felt that my imagination was my strongest faculty, and I had never been able to give it full permission to kind of run. And so between teaching college and university, I had a year off. And I said to myself, after reading one famous writer, I can do this. I have stories to tell. And so I began writing my first novel, Fire in a Windless Place. But what happened, Chris, was that it was like a tsunami of creativity. I mean, one book followed after another, one story after another. It was as if my imagination had been stifled or stymied, and it was just eager to burst out. And so I started writing and traveling to the places I was writing, but I always stayed in touch with my academic background, because for me, I believe with the classical writers that knowledge is power, and that the whole purpose really of a good writer is to produce books that are a testament to the harmonious self, in which everything is operative. Okay. And so that's how I did it. I decided that I would address the full extent of who I was and the full extent of my listeners, namely their mental, emotional, spiritual, and physical resources. I wanted to appeal to the full person. And so that's what I become, a fiction writer. I left the university about 10 years ago. I risked spending full time writing, even though I still mentor students. But I said to myself, if you don't venture it, there's nothing gained. So that's how you find me this morning.
It is an amazing story, but you've glossed over way too much of it. There are so many nooks and crannies and other places that I think that it's like the tip of the iceberg. Talk about for a minute growing up with your mother, who ended up writing 29 volumes of material, and what you found in there that really resonated with you in terms of how then you were putting these books together and put these pieces of fiction together.
Question. In all of the 29 volumes, she never crossed out. In other words, whatever she wrote was what she wanted on the paper that was before her. And she always said to me, think things through before you put them down. Now, she had no computer.
Right.
She was a terrific typist, but she wasn't able to revise as we can on a computer. We can always edit a text. What she did was to edit everything in her mind. So she gave me the feeling when I read her that this was as complete a statement as she really wanted. And also the other thing that I got was extraordinary compression in what she wrote. There was an enormous economy of language. She never wasted a word. I think Mother's adage was, never say more than is, never deny what is not. I mean, she was a great truth teller. Maybe it was because she was born under the sign of Sagittarius, and I'm told that Sagittarian women are very, very frank. Well, candor was one of my mother's great qualities. I mean, she's the only person I know who would wince when someone would use an improper past participle. If you said, I could have went, she would put her hand to her face. It wasn't very nice, but that's how much she loved the English language. So I learned all of that from her. And even when she spoke to us, to my sister, to my brother, and to me, she had such a cadence in her voice. In fact, she was a great lover of great speeches. Do you know that at the age of 3 years old, she taught me the Gettysburg Address?
You're kidding.
I was able to repeat Lincoln's. It's a fact. And the only reason why I believe it is that we have a film of it. She taught me a phrase every morning and then repeated what went before till after several weeks, I was able to recite it. Now, I didn't know exactly what I was saying at 3 years old, but she would give me the gestures, the intonation of voice, and so forth. It's really quite charming to watch. But from an early age, I learned from her that language was our deepest experience. It was the most precious thing we had, and that if you were going to use it, you had to use it as its best. So she was my first and foremost role model.
What a role model. My God. So many things that you talked about. Talk a little bit about what economy of language, why that was important to her. And I assume that that's now important to you as well.
I think she felt, as I do, that if you wasted words, you would tire your audience. And so I keep that same rule in mind when I write. Every word counts. I warn my reader implicitly, if you don't pay attention, this will not come around twice. So what you see on the page is what you get, and you had better pay attention to it. So I never waste words. You know, it was extremely difficult, by the way, to maintain this high norm for writing well, because, you know, as a teacher, and especially as a comparative historian of religions, where I was teaching Buddhism and Taoism, and I was teaching the esoteric nature of Sufism and so forth, my students couldn't understand what I said just by saying it once. So I had to repeat myself, come at it with metaphors and similes. In other words, to teach well, I had to learn how to be pedagogically redundant. I had to learn that that was not of value when I was writing, that redundancy had to go. So here I was, exercising two identities, one which said, you better help them to understand this difficult matter. You better know how to repeat yourself. And in the other case, where the remark was in the back of my head, say it once, Joseph, don't repeat yourself. So I've learned how to do one or the other. I'm not quite sure which one is operative now. You seem to get me to want to say the same thing in a new way, and I'm happy to do it because I know there's a listening audience who's trying to understand my point of view. But as a general rule, when I write, there's an enormous economy of language. I don't repeat myself.
And so the other thing that you mentioned that your mom said was that language is one of our deepest expressions of who we are. Is that right?
Absolutely. Yes, very definitely. It's the most human thing we do. You can put a typewriter in front of a chimp, and he may bang on the letters, but you won't get anything that equals something like even the simple sentences of a very intelligent young child. I mean, language, especially English. Now, I happen to be very lucky. I was bilingual as a child. I spoke Italian. And then as I continued in my studies, I had to pick up more and more languages. I had Latin, Greek, and Hebrew as my classical and biblical background. I knew Italian. The Jesuits taught me German and French. And then when I went to Harvard, I started picking up Indian languages. So what did that repertoire of languages teach me? In each case, I saw the efforts of writers to be very, very dexterous in the language that they chose. And, every language teaches you something. For instance, when I got to Bangkok to do my research for my doctoral thesis at Harvard, I had to learn to speak Thai. Now, Thai is a tonal language, and I had never learned tones before as a way of expressing meaning. So here was a whole new experience for me, how language can express itself to different people in different ways. In other words, Mother's early affirmation continued to be affirmed in and through my undergraduate and graduate studies, especially when I was learning to read comparative religious texts in the original languages. And so, from a number of quarters, I am confirmed in recognizing that language, and especially English, is our most precious possession as human beings.
It is something that I don't think many people think about, but when you phrase it that way, my God, it is really the way that we, I mean, obviously it's the way that we communicate, but I think what I hear you saying is it's so much deeper than just that, isn't it?
Absolutely. And it's in the innuendo that we frequently understand what we really meant. One person said to me, Joseph, could you summarize in a couplet, a rhyming couplet, what your feeling is for language? And I wrote this: what better use for words than to inspire? It's not by chance desire rhymes with fire.
One
See,
of the words,
you chuckle.
I think it's so deep, and yet it's
you hear.
Sorry, go ahead.
Funny. It's funny. Yeah. I think there's something. That's another thing that I've realized, that truth frequently expresses itself in wit and in humor, because it's in the nuance that we laugh. Some of the great comics that we've listened to or we still have on TV are very adept at using language, not so much to be fully expressive, but to be sly. And what that does is it forces the mind to reach for what's really being meant.
Yes.
I mean, how often, I think women are extraordinary at this. If you say, they listen in a completely different way from the way men listen. They're always listening for the nuance, what I always refer to as the subtitle. Men can say all sorts of things, but women listen for what's really being said. And I think in that regard, it's always good for a male writer to exercise a certain amount of femininity in the way he thinks. Okay. In fact, a man has, I think one of the great ways I know that I have grown as a writer is not only insofar as I've become a better stylist, but I'm able to draw female characters so that women have said to me, how do you know that about us? That's a very good question. How do you know that about us? I said, well, at least we have our humanity in common.
And it's a huge compliment too. And when you talk about being more feminine in your writing, it's more an intuitive thing, isn't it?
It is. Well, it's often called polymorphous perversity, is a funny way of putting it. But technically speaking, when I first created my a female character, her name is Maya Ratnapur, and she's a Thai character. I read the section where Thai is speaking to her ex-lover, and I read it to one of my friends, Maureen, who is one of my perfect and great editors. And I said to her, Maureen, how did I do, Maureen? She said to me on the phone, Joseph, you got it just right. And there was a slight note of sensuality in the way she said it that had me laughing. But anyhow, women are great teachers. And if I know anything about them, it's because they've educated me. I've often said with Sherlock Holmes, when Dr. Watson says to him, Sherlock, how do you know that? And he turns to Dr. Watson and says, the problem with you, Watson, is that you see, but you don't observe. And I could probably say the same thing. The problem with you, Watson, is that you hear, but you don't listen. And it's both those things. It's both observing and listening that you finally educate yourself.
So let's move on, because one thing that really fascinates me about you, and I'm sure how it's influenced your writing, is not only you're being taught by Jesuits who are, I think the simple way to describe them is Catholic academics. Is that a fair statement? Yes.
And they've been called, the most intelligent group of priests who teach and write. I mean, there are many who are intelligent in any, but the fact is that to become a Jesuit, at least as I understood it, was at least 15 years of education before you could be ordained a priest. Boy. So they were very, very demanding in their academics. Yes, I think you're absolutely right about the Jesuits.
So one of the things that you ended up doing was a lot of work on comparative religion. And I think that is so important in terms of determining who and what you are in terms of your writing. It's just got to be such a huge piece of it.
Absolutely. You're absolutely right. I'll tell you why. Whenever I start a project, even if I don't think I know that much about it, I'm not frightened by it, because I always feel that I have at my fingertips where I need to go to learn what I need to know.
Mm-hmm.
You know, Nietzsche once said, a man can put up with any how if he has a why. What that means basically is that human beings are creatures of meaning. You know, we need to wake up with purposefulness in our lives. Most people who experience deep depression, you know, who even contemplate suicide, is because they have no reason for living. And what the great religious traditions do, whether it's Buddhism, Hinduism, Taoism, the Confucian tradition, Islam, Judaism, or finally Christianity, what they offer are patterns of meaning in which they say, all you need to do is internalize one of these, and you will not have to improvise. You will know what to do in a moral situation. You will know how to act. You will know how to behave. Okay? That's what you will have. You will never be at a loss. And if you have more than one religious tradition teaching you a meaning pattern, you will become a polyglot of the spirit. You will be, as it were, like someone who speaks more than one language. In this case, it will be more than one language of meaning. So what happens, it's like a chorale. It's like a chorale of voices that I hear whenever I approach writing about anything. And I move in a very gingerly way from one tradition to the next. You know, there are times where when I'm confronted by a particular problem, I have a feeling that the Buddha's experience is more adept at addressing what my real issue is. And I find the answer in what I remember of having studied. I can even go to the original texts. When it comes to an issue, for instance, about mercy, I think of Jesus, for instance, who, as far as I'm concerned, was one of the great storytellers of history. In fact, all you need to do is to go to Luke's Gospel, to the chapter in which he deals with the parable of the prodigal son, and you have this extraordinary story of a boy who asks for his inheritance from his father, gets it and squanders it on loose living, and then comes back penitent, hungry, and kneels before his father saying, I have sinned before heaven and before you. I am not worthy to be called your son. And the father has already been out there looking and searching the horizon for his son. I mean, he's the maternal father. The father accepts the son's confession, but doesn't say a word to him about what he's become. He just calls his servants over and said, let us have a feast. Get a cloak and a ring for my son, and let us rejoice and roast the fatted calf, because my son who was lost is now found. What an extraordinary parable of divine mercy that is, and what an extraordinary parable it is for human beings to be able to forgive and to be forgiven. It's all there in that one story. As I've said, if Jesus had just written that one story, he would have laid claim to being one of the great storytellers of history. But you know, you will find similar stories in Taoism and Islam and Buddhism and Hinduism. They're extraordinary. These are all patterns of meaning. So to answer your question more directly, is when I sit down to write, I feel like I have a library that is operative in my head from which I can draw freely any book I want. Does that help?
It helps. And, you know, I think the thing that comes through more than anything else in what you've just talked about is the importance of meaning. I talk a little bit about how that presents itself in your books and in your work.
Well, I'll give you a very good example of what for me meaning is, or at least is how it should be expressed. It should be expressed by addressing all of the senses. Whatever meaning is in my books or any book, whatever meaning is expressed in and through my characters. It's also expressed in and through the five senses. You will hear it, taste it, smell it. You will see it, especially. In other words, it will address you as a complete person. You know, back in the 1950s, probably you're too young to remember this, but you may want to Google it. From 1953 to 1972, there was a program on TV called You Are There, and it was hosted by Walter Cronkite. And what it did was it created something totally new in reporting. A camera started covering historical events as though they were breaking news. So you would be there at the death of Socrates, the assassination of Julius Caesar, Mark Antony's obituary, or Napoleon's rise to the throne as emperor. In other words, it was an effort to engage you completely. And one of the things I learned in and through the Jesuits was that when we were taught to meditate on the biblical experience, we were taught to engage our five senses. So, for instance, when I was watching Moses part the Red Sea so the Israelites could pass through, I could hear the waters parting. I can see them. I could feel the spray in my face. I could hear the notes of awe in the voices of the people as they walk through. I mean, it was an experience of You Are There. So what I'm saying is, to speak of meaning is very abstract. I want to feel it, and therefore I want my readers to feel it. So if and when they enter one of my books, they will be completely engaged. One of the nicest things I had said to me didn't appear nice in the beginning. I remember giving a book to one of my neighbors, Ida, to read. The next morning, I was out in the corridor, and she saw me. She said, "You know, Joseph, I'm really mad at you." I said, "Ida, what? Have I said something?" She said, "No." She said, "I started your book before I went to bed. I couldn't fall asleep." She said, "I got up in the middle of the night and I read through right till the morning because I had to turn the page." And there it is. That's the empirical evidence that you got what you needed to get. You've hooked your reader.
That
the last
must
sentence
be
of the last paragraph.
Sorry, I apologize. That must be
No,
the greatest compliment ever.
It is. It is. But, you know, let me just say something. Here's something I can say to you. I don't know. We've been on the phone maybe for 35 minutes now. Does it feel like that? Absolutely not.
No.
No. The reason is because you and I have been hooked on meaning. Yep. And that means that we have transcended the space continuum. We are in some ways in transcendent ways. Okay. And that's what makes human beings different from the animal kingdom. We certainly participate in animality, but it's our capacity to transcend and to engage ourselves in moments of deep meaning, whether they be verbal or even deeply emotional. Love can do the same thing. It can so engage us that we can forget ourselves. We are really living ecstatically.
You've mentioned a couple of words. One is inspired, which I often think of as being in spirit, and then ecstatically is another one. Talk a little bit about, you have two types of books that you've written. One, The Mansions of Limbo and Outward Signs are both collections of stories. Talk a little bit about those two books and kind of what people should expect from them.
Well, they're glimpses of human experience, deeply engaging, but they have a beginning and a middle and an end that you can anticipate as you go along. So that they're not full symphonies, as for instance the novels are. Mm-hmm. They're what you might call you might call them a Bach fugue, for instance, in which several short, intermittent musical phrases interweave with one another until finally they're resolved. Let me give you an example.
Please.
This actually happened to me. One is called What's Good or Bad. Actually, it's one of the last short stories in the book Twists of Faith. I was on a boat on Lake Como after having checked on a ferry schedule for one of my novels. I knew that it had changed. I flew back to Italy and went to Como to get the ferry schedule so that my book would be accurate. I was taking the ferry back to my hotel, the Hotel Trimezzo on Como, and there was a older couple. They must have been in their late 70s, maybe even early 80s. It was very, very warm. I was sitting in the shade. I got up to the two of them, and Mary and John took my seat. I offered it to them, and they were very grateful. I found myself getting off the ferry at the same stop that they did. We were, the three of us, staying at the same hotel. So what they did was they invited me to afternoon tea. So we started chatting, and I said to them, "What brings you back here? You seem to have been here before." "Oh, yes, we are celebrating our 50th anniversary. We met here and fell in love in this hotel 50 years ago." So I looked at John, and I said, "John, 50 years ago, this was still a very expensive hotel. How did you afford it?" So Mary said to him, "Tell him, Joseph, how it happened." So he told me, he said to me, I had just finished at University of London. I had received a job to work at Deutsche Bank. On my first day going to work, I decided to take a shortcut through the park, and the bus that had lost control of its brakes hit me, and I was thrown about 40 feet. I somehow landed in the grass, managed to be alive, but I found myself in a cast and in hospital for almost 6 months. What came of it, though, was that I was awarded enough money so that I didn't have to work for the rest of my life. I still did. But once I got out of hospital, I decided that I would travel and see life, because I realized you're only human once. So I used the money to go to Lake Como, and I found myself in this hotel, and I met Mary with her escort, her aunt. And I asked her to dance with her aunt's permission. When we went back to London, I started dating her, and I married her. We are now throwing a 50th anniversary party when we get back. And Joseph, we've invited everybody, and we would like to invite you. So I turned to the two of them and I said, "Haven't you forgotten somebody who made it possible?" So they looked at me and they said, "No, we don't think so. I mean, we're inviting you." "No," I said, "I don't mean me. I mean the bus driver."
Wow.
So they looked at me. They decided to check where he lived. He was in an old age home, suffering to some degree from dementia. They got to know him, and on the day of the party, they invited him with their sons and daughters and grandchildren. They were all there. John stood up. I was there, and he turned to everyone. And he said, "I want to thank you all for coming, but I especially want to thank my guest here, Andrew, who was the one who made it all possible. He was the bus driver. Granted, at one point I got hurt, but then what's good or bad? Without the money that came from the settlement, I wouldn't have known my wife. There wouldn't have been any marriage or children. You would not have been here. Andrew, would you like to stand up and make a statement?" He stood up and said, "So glad I could be of help." The way the story ends is John and Mary said to me, "Joseph, so glad you could be of help." And that's the way the story ends. That's exactly as it happened. I just simply wrote it down.
Boy.
The stories are all like that. They're all things that have happened to me.
It is. There's so many levels that that story can hit you. But when you look at it, for you to recognize something as simple as the bus driver, and yet be able to plumb the depths, as it were, of how that created such an amazing and meaningful story for a couple and all the people that were impacted by them. What a story.
Yes, and sometimes it can be very, very funny. Here's one that's somewhat farcical. I was taking my elevator up in my current building, 1 Union Square South, and the numbers were not very clear. So I was at that time on, I think, floor 14. So I looked and I realized there was no 13th floor. I said, wow, that's curious. I wonder whether that's true of other buildings. I mean, mine is considered to be a first-class building. So you know what I did? I visited 10 other buildings, Chris, in my area, all first-class establishments. There was no 13th floor.
I'll be.
And when I did some research on it, I realized it's what the Greeks called triskaidekaphobia, the fear of the number 10 and 3, the fear of the number 13. You will not find the number 13 on any major building. And when I checked the 13, or what would have been the 13th floor in this current building, that would have meant 20 more apartments. My building is losing $120,000 a month in order to maintain a superstition. So I decided to write a short story called The 13th Floor, in which a group of architects call themselves the 13 Club, and they start putting up a building which has a 13th floor. Their intent is to put up only buildings that have 13 floors. So they put up the first building. It's beautifully accomplished, the 13th floor especially, and people start moving in. Within a month of the floor being full, every apartment being rented, funny things start happening. Railings give way. People start plummeting into awnings below. Screws are loose. Until they realize that someone with a screw loose has loosened all of the screws on all of the apartments on the 13th floor in an effort to punish the architects for as it were, not respecting the superstition. So it's a farce. It's quite funny, but it just started off with an observation of no 13th floor in my elevator. So that's another story. Sometimes it's not always profound or serious. Sometimes it can be very funny.
So we're running out of time, but I would like you to just pick one of your books that are novels and just talk about one of your favorite passages so that we can give people a real sense, not only of the books that are a series of stories, but your novels as well.
Okay. I think that's easily done right now because the novel that I will address is actually a novella. It's just been cast into a treatment form and to a screenplay. And I think it will start being peddled to a production company. Of course, if there's anyone out there who is in charge of a production company and would be interested in reading the screenplay or work with the premise, I'm happy to send it on. It's the novel Island of the Assassin. The premise is this: a man who is a writer meets an older man while they're traveling. They become very, very close friends. And Peter helps Aldo get through a depression because he's lost his wife as they travel together. When Aldo dies, he remembers Peter in his will as the person who left him with a sense of hope. And when Peter has the will read to him, he finds out that he's been left an island by Aldo with a full staff and a villa. Who work on the island are a cook and a gardener, but also a man who is responsible for protecting the island, for securing its security. His name is Kyle Landry. Kai is a very mysterious man. He's always dressed in black. He wears a hoodie and so forth. He works there in order to disguise his real work, which is for the CIA. We're in on weekends. He kills or assassinates assassins. And what makes him so fascinating is that he uses no gun or knife. He kills them with 2 fingers by lunging for the carotid artery in the neck.
Wow.
So, if you want a scene in which my readers would be intrigued, first time that Peter confronts Kai and Kai tells him that he kills, but he doesn't murder, and then does it with his 2 fingers. Peter says to him, "How can you do that?" The next thing you know that Peter is comatose on the ground, coming to. Kai knows how to press the artery, either to deny oxygen temporarily or entirely. When Peter comes through to his full awareness, he sees Kai looking down with him with a smile on his face. He suddenly realized that he has truly hired an assassin. How's that for a seed?
Love it. Love it. Joseph Roccasalvo, you are an amazing, amazing man. And I just have such respect, not only for the books that you've written, but all of the fabulous experiences from your mom and how she talked about having a language be brief and to the point, to your education and your travel, comparative religion. You are fascinating, and I want to just have everybody know, in no uncertain terms, that the place to go to find out more is Joseph Roccasalvo, ROCCASALVO.com, josephRoccasalvo.com, where all of his books are listed and also how to contact you. Joseph, what should people know? What's the one thing you want people to know about you and your books?
I would like them to know that our common struggle as human beings is to engage in a life that issues in the harmonious self, in which the mind, the emotions, the body, and the spirit are all engaged, okay? They are the 4 rooms which we must visit every day, in which we open up the windows and let the oxygen in. If they will go to my books, they will see and feel and experience human beings like themselves, male and female and everything in between, who are struggling to find that harmonious self. And maybe when they close the book, having experienced a sense of identity with one or another of my characters, maybe they will know how to do it for themselves.
What a fabulous way to close. Joseph Roccasalvo, author, intellectual, just an amazing man. Thank you so much for your time. Everybody, you can find Joseph at Joseph Roccasalvo, ROCCASALVO.com, josephRoccasalvo.com. Joseph, thank you so very much.
Thank you, Chris, for being such a superb interview. I loved it.
You've reached the end of another episode of the Global Summit House podcast. Subscribe to our podcast on Spotify, Podbean, iHeartRadio, iTunes, or Google Play. Connect with us at globalsummithouse.com. See you on the next episode.